This is the fourth of our little series on Ephesians. I'll say it until I'm blue in the face. If you want to hear 1, 2 and 3, you can find them on the YouTube channel. Do bookmark it, or whatever one does with YouTube. If you don't like it, you don't bookmark. I think you follow a YouTube channel. Follow us on YouTube. You'll remember from last week that the epistle to the Ephesians is really divided into two parts, into theology in the first 3 chapters and application in the second 3 chapters. It's quite a nice, neat division, half and half. Last week we began on the application and discovered that, funnily enough, the application was filled with theology. Well, this week we delve a little deeper into application and find, funnily enough, a little bit of theology informs what that application might look like. However, one of the problems with the reading that we had today was that it was only a bit of what's actually a longer passage. Really, the section that we're looking at today should start not at verse 25 where we began, but at verse 17 of chapter 4, and then not at verse 2 of chapter 5, but really probably at verse 14. Trouble is that's far too long a slab to read out on a Sunday morning, so the lectionary cuts it down to something manageable. The problem with that is that we miss the context of what we got today, and actually also, I think, we miss the theological point. The longer passage begins like this. Now this I affirm and insist on in the Lord, you must no longer live as the Gentiles live, in the futility of their minds. They are darkened in their understanding, alienated from the life of God because of their ignorance and hardness of heart, and so on in that vein. Don't live like the Gentiles anymore. But hang on, if we think back to week 1, this is a Gentile community that he's writing to. So he's saying to Gentiles, don't live like Gentiles. Okay, well, if not like Gentiles, like what? Well, those who are now followers of Christ. Followers of Christ. And really, everything that follows on is all about what it is that's about your life as a follower of Christ that should make you look different from the other Gentiles. Interestingly, in the next little bit of the letter that we don't get read because it's a bit nasty, we get all the stuff that actually is about how you should try and look like everyone around you, even though you're not like everyone around you. It's this funny little dichotomy. We, as those who follow Christ, are supposed to be different and yet not to stand out. The church has been tearing its hair out about what that's supposed to look like pretty much ever since, and come up with some pretty strange answers. But we're in this section of the letter where a clear dichotomy is drawn. In another one of the little bits that we didn't get this morning, he talks about those who are the children of light and those who are the children of darkness, and we are to be the children of light, not the children of darkness. The author of this letter, second generation Paul, is latching on to the Pauline idea of putting on the armour of light and so on, and carrying it that one step further to turn it into a dichotomy which is actually rather difficult, particularly if you're those who are walking in the darkness rather than in the light. Suggestions of very clear-cut boundaries of those who are in and those who are out. But in trying to define the application of the theology that's been talked about in the first part of the letter, we get a very important theological point, which actually begins and ends in the same place. The theological point is there at the end of the reading that we had today. Therefore, whenever there's a therefore, you always know there's something important about to be said. Therefore, be imitators of God as beloved children, and live in love as Christ loved us. Live in love as Christ loved us. The idea of imitating God is actually a really strong idea, by which I mean it's going much further than is normal. The early Pauline epistles will frequently talk about imitating Christ, but this is the only spot in the whole New Testament where anyone talks about imitating God as a whole. But the thing in which we are to imitate God is not in every respect. I mean, we're not to become the creator, you know. We are to imitate God in love. We are to imitate God in love. Because I've talked about this letter being theology and application, but what it's really doing is addressing the two fundamental Pauline questions that are right there throughout the Pauline epistle, whether it's the absolutely definitely written by Paul letters or also the later ones that are maybe not, or the ones that definitely aren't. The same two questions are there all the way through. Question number one, who was/is Jesus? Who is Jesus? It's a fundamental question for the first generation of Christians, and the second and the third, and even for us. Who is Jesus? And so much of the Pauline corpus is answering that question. Who is Jesus? And the second question is, okay, having established something of who Jesus is, how ought I to live, how ought you to live, how ought we to live in the light of that knowledge? And the fundamental answer to the question, who is Jesus, that is brought to the fore in Ephesians is love. Who is Jesus? Jesus is love. Who is God? God is love. We've heard that in other places as well. And therefore, how ought we to live in the consequences of Jesus being love? Well, we ought to be imitators of God by being those who love. It is a theology that begins and ends with love. And so all of the other stuff that's really almost like a set of proverbs, isn't it, that Greg read out for us before, all of these things about things that we ought to do ultimately come down to the test of love. All of these things that follow on that we are uncomfortable with need to be understood in terms of this writer writing to a community saying, this is how you can live out a life that is based on love. And the question of application, therefore, for us is not going to be the same sorts of questions and answers that were put to the Ephesians in the first century or so, but the question will be the same, even if the answer is different. If Jesus is love, how can we live in the light of that today? What do we need to do? How do we need to live in order to be those who live in love? How can we be imitators of Christ, imitators even of God in Christ? Live in love as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us, a fragrant offering and sacrifice to God. All of the rest follows on from that. Everything we do Sunday by Sunday, everything we do beyond that follows on from this idea of following Christ in love. So this second question of Paul, how might we live in the light of who Jesus really is, comes down to that. Which brings me to another little set of questions with which to leave you thinking. If Jesus is love, if God is love, and if we are to live in the light of that love, how does being a follower of Christ change you? How does being a follower of Christ make you different in the way that you think, in the way that you act, towards yourself, towards your neighbour, as well as in relation to God? How does being a person of love change the way that you operate as a human being in the world? Does it make a difference? Hopefully it does. How? I can answer that question in a rum kind of a way for myself. But every one of you will answer that question in a different rum kind of a way for your own selves. That is part of the Christian discipleship journey. Working out what it means for me, in the light of Christ, to live as someone who lives in the love of God and communicates that love of God to those around me. That is the gospel message in a nutshell. Maybe that's the reason that even if it's not quite written by Paul, Ephesians gets into the bigger book.